Well, greetings to everyone. I'm going to be doing, I'm going to give you a little bit. You've probably never seen me before. My name is Whitmar McConnell. I live in Means, Kentucky, in the U.S., and I am a market grower. Actually, I'm in the process of retiring from market growing, but I've been market growing produce and specialty crops for 32 years. For the last 15 years, I've been doing consulting with other market growers and specialty crop growers and gardeners to help them develop their soils so that they can have the maximum benefit from whatever scale that they're growing at. Just a little bit more background. I came into the Adventist movement when I was 25 years old, back in 1983. And when I learned the health message, it just blew me away. The spiritual message was incredible itself, but the health message was something that I had never heard in my life. And the first thought in my mind was, why are they not teaching this in the school system? Why is everybody not learning this? Well, of course, I've been around a few years since then, and I kind of understand why that's the reality of things. I grew up around agriculture. I'm very familiar with it. And when I learned that health message, I decided that going back to school to become a doctor was what I needed to do. Now, I didn't want to be a practicing physician. I wanted to do a dual degree and MD, PhD program so that I could teach is primarily what I wanted to do. And in my heart, I thought that was the best way that I could spread the message. And, as I share this, I have nothing negative to say about the medical profession, or I will not say anything negative about the medical profession. Especially in this day and age, without it, we'd be in bad trouble. Now, we're even in worse shape because we don't have the true health message. But given the state of the health of society, we're in a pretty bad way if we didn't have at least the medical services that we do. So I did. I went back to school to be a doctor. In the process of doing that, I'm going to make this short because I don't want to take too much of the time with this. And first, let me say, I said I grew up around agriculture, but I saw all the problems. This was way back in the 70s. I saw all the problems that agriculture and food production already had. And I didn't really want to have anything to do with it. Nothing. I was going to do anything but that. And so I go off to school to prepare to become a doctor so that I could share the health message. And God, and I won't share all that story. Maybe you can ask me later somewhere if I'm around, and I'll share more of the details of it. But God, in essence, told me He wanted me to be a farmer. Now, that you can imagine, that message was not the message I wanted to hear, but that was the message that I received. And through several providential circumstances and everything, God made it very clear that was. He knew my heart. He knew what I wanted to do, and so I needed to be a farmer. And so I decided, okay, well, I got to change course here, and I need to find a school where I can do agronomy or soil science or some program like that and everything. And God made it very clear again to me, no, that's not what I want you to do. I will teach you. And so I went home in this state of, okay, well, what do I need to learn? Where do I need to go? Because the only place I really knew to go was the university, or you could just learn anecdotally and from experience or people growing, and so I started looking at different schools of thought in agriculture and everything like that, and what would be the most valuable thing to learn and everything. So God still said, no, I'm going to teach you. And the bottom line is He did. I believe He did, and I'm here to share with you what I've learned over 32 years of growing produce, and now 15 years of helping other growers to grow nutritious food. And there is a difference between food and nutritious food, a very big difference. And we'll get into that as we go through the slides here in the presentation. We're going to start off here with principles, because you're going to get overwhelmed with what I share with you. I assure you, I've done this many times, and I see that glassy-eyed, because the reality is that most of us don't really know what you're supposed to do. We follow, or we're not even involved in it at all. How many of you garden? Okay, good. Any of you actual market growers or grow to sell? A market grower is somebody that grows produce to sell a market. So we've grown as many as 50, 60 different varieties of produce and take them to a farmer's market, or there's a variety of ways that are sold now. You can have what are called CSAs, which are community supported agriculture, where people buy a share of your product and everything. Anyway, after answering that question, I remembered I didn't say to you, if we could hold questions till the end of the presentation, I'm going to try to save time. And I understand there's going to be a panel on Friday. So if through the process, there's things that come up and you want to know, if you could just hold them till the end, you'll probably get the answer. If you don't, then I'll leave time for that. But anyway, I'll just finish that one. A market grower, takes it to the market to sell. And then there's all kinds of things above that. You've got field crop growers and specialty crop growers. I work with a grower in Tanzania, Africa, that grows 1,200 acres of avocados. And I share that because it doesn't matter if you have a little backyard garden or you have 10,000 acres that you're farming. The principles of soil fertility are exactly the same. What's different is how you manage it all, at those different scales and variety. If you're growing one or two crops like corn or soybeans on 10,000 acres, well, you have two crops that you have to manage. If you're growing like I have done in the past, where you're growing 50 or 60 different types of fruits and vegetables, and they all have different timings and conditions and everything like that to manage. It's just a difference in management. And then another thing that we'll talk about some as we go through is, what is the context and how are you going to set everything up? Because you have to have one or two things, whether you're a gardener or anything above that, is you have to have really good equipment or you have to have really good labor. And if you're just a gardener, that's probably going to be you or your kids or both to accomplish that. But you can't have neither, because things just don't work well that way. Really don't work well that way. So we're going to go through these principles, and it doesn't matter the crop you're growing, it doesn't matter the scale that you're growing at. These principles will not change. This is God's model for agriculture. And if you understand what we just talked about, these principles, and you can take them out, there are gazillions of videos. There's tons of information on YouTube about different growing practices, and you'll find all kinds of stuff on soil fertility too. Much of which, if you were actually to probe those schools of thought, you would discover that we all like to hide our dirty laundry when things just don't really work. We like to show it when it works. I'll use one illustration because I like this one because of an experience I had with it. Has anybody heard of the Back to Eden method? Does anybody use that method? Okay, what you'll discover, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along, is that every school of thought has some truth to it. But it has a lot of other things that get left out. And so some of the aspects of using Back to Eden is mulching the soil helps to maintain more stable temperatures and moisture levels, and that increases the ability of plants to grow and microbes to function in the soil and everything. But if the conditions in the soil are not proper, you can get really messed up using that. I'll just share a story. He knows I'm going to share the story, so it's okay. I'll leave names out though. But a friend of mine who lived in another state wanted to use that method, and he asked me. He said, "What do you think about me using that method?" And I know what his soil was like. And I said, I don't think it's a good idea because you don't have good soil structure. I said, if you put that, now it was a lower rainfall area, so there wasn't a lot of rain. But I said, if you put that mulch on that soil and you get much moisture at all, it's just going to turn into a swamp because that water can't drain through the soil. It's just going to sit there, and the mulch is going to help keep it there. Well, a year later, I was at a convention, and he came walking down the hall at lunchtime like a dog with his tail between his legs, and looking at me. And he came over to the table and sat down. And I said, "You didn't do the back to Eden method, did you?" And he said, "Yeah, I did." I said, "Well, what happened?" My garden and yard turned into a swamp. There are conditions that have to be met. You have to understand, no matter what school of thought you're listening to, and I'm going to cover a broad range of these so that you have these principles to ask the questions about, okay, what's valid about this, and what should I be concerned about with it? And so he didn't have the conditions where that was going to be real helpful to him. Now other people do it, and it works out really well for them. And so then they tell her, you ought to do the back to Eden method because it works really well. But the problem is, do you have the conditions where it's going to work really well like those? And we're all different. Soils are different, just like you and I. We have parent material, and that parent material wants to express itself, and it's not complete and balanced. And I've looked at soils and their makeup all over the world, thousands of samples. And I can show you the Bible's correct when it says there are none righteous, not one. It applies to soils too. And so you need to know, what is a good model? What should I be trying to achieve with my soil? And then you have to find out, well, where is the state of my soil? What are the conditions that I do have? And I'll just tell you right now that there's really only one model that's correct. We're going to look at it here in just a couple minutes. There's only one model that's correct. Just like we only have one model for life, don't we? We don't have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. I mean, some people believe that. You can go to India and they've got thousands of them. But we only have one model, and that's Jesus. And so we can measure ourselves against Christ and determine our weaknesses and our deficiencies, and we can pursue reformation. We can pursue healing and the correcting of our character, and we should be. The same thing is true with the soil. You can do the same thing. And I'll just give you a couple illustrations. When God asked Noah to build the ark, what did he do? Did he give Noah a catalog of boats and tell him to pick the one you thought would work best? No, he didn't. What did he do? He gave him the instructions. And what did he tell him to do? Build it exactly the way I told you to build it. How about the sanctuary? Yeah, he didn't give Moses a catalog of house plans and ask him to pick one that he thought would, work out the best. He gave him instructions, and he told him to follow the instructions exactly the way I told you to follow them. Okay? So that's what we're going to look at today. And we're going to go through some stuff, and you're not going to remember all of it. And I think they're recording this, and so you'll be able to go back and watch it again. At Agra has also recorded this, both audio, I think, and video, and then they have the PowerPoints, and I can leave the PowerPoints in either PowerPoints or PDF files for you if you want it, because I have had to learn what I understand now. I have had to go back. Well, when I was learning the basic principles of it, I had to go back 6 or 7 times, and I still go back and refresh my memory on it because we're learning new things. I'll just throw it out there because I might forget to do it. We just learned, they just changed the categorization of iodine. It used to be that it wasn't considered an important element, even though we realize that people have to have iodine. Animals have to have iodine. People have to have iodine, right? So they supplement the animals with an iodine supplement. It's typically kelp meal, that they'll put in, but sometimes they have an actual like calcium iodate or potassium iodate that they'll add into the feed, because they know that that feed is so poor that that animal is not going to survive without it. Now they add a whole bunch of other things, but the interesting thing is they don't tell people. I guess if you consume meat, then you might be okay. Now there's a lot of other issues that go along with that, but the cow always gets its revenge. Let me just put it that way. Um, so So there's a whole list, and we're going to go through them. But there's a whole list of these elements. I think it's like 17 is up to now, but they just changed iodine to they don't call it essential, because a plant can grow without it not very well, and we're going to get into that too. But if you want it to thrive, you have to have it's involved in at least 82 protonation functions and everything, and photosynthesis depends on it. And so photosynthesis will work without it, but not very well. I'll just throw this out there too. Let's see, we're in Canada. You guys go by metric. So it's like, I think it's 50 billion acres, hectares, I'm sorry. You're okay with it? Okay. Well, it's about 50 billion hectares of agricultural land in the world. And it produces about 5 billion tons of food. So lots of food is grown in the world, and lots of people consume it. You all ate this morning, I assume, right? And yet at the same time that all this food is being produced, by the way, of that 5 billion tons, about 1.5 billion tons is wasted. People all the time say, we have too many people on this planet. And I say, no, we don't have good principles on this planet. That's the problem. We could feed awful lot more people than we are. But in spite of the fact, and not considering that the reality is that there are a lot of people that are malnourished, they don't get enough food, but the majority of the society does get enough food. And yet we're losing the health battle. Am I wrong? The health condition of society and the most prominent deterioration now is in mental health. But we're losing that battle. And yet people have full bellies. We're going to talk about the difference between photosynthetic production and biosynthetic production as we get along here. So I just want to give you some frameworks before we get in here. So, because, well, I'll save that. But, there's food and people are eating. And yet people are still getting sick more frequently and more severely and in more different ways. And now it's probably been affecting it for a long time. But like I said, you don't have to look very far and wide now to see the mental health of society is rapidly going downhill. So, so I assume your goal, since you're here, is you want to be well nourished. You want to be fully nourished. And so hopefully you can take something away from this that will help you to pursue that goal and not just have a full belly. So we're going to look at principles. Now, I originally had this title, Soil Fertility Fundamentals, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? For any of you that garden, you don't have any problems, right? No bugs, no diseases, no weeds. Because if you do, I just need to get down and listen to what you have to say. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. But do you know that there's a reason why they go wrong? And that reason can be addressed. And I will tell you right off the start here that you can develop food production, whether it's at the gardening scale, and I know farms with 10,000 acres that has no insect pressure and no disease pressure and minimal weed pressure, or none at all, depending on what they're willing to do. Does that sound good? Now, nobody believed me when I told them that. Probably, 10, 15 years ago, but now another person more prominent than me, he's not an Adventist, but he's, promotes regenerative agriculture and everything, and he's asserted the same thing because they've demonstrated it. So I'm glad, because it's just not me out there saying something, people looking at me like, what's the matter with him? Okay, so let's get into this a little bit. Two quotes here. This top one, I like it. I don't know what she meant by it. It's her way of expressing what the naturalist John Muir said, which is, when you tug on one thing in nature, you find out it's connected to everything else. But she put it this way: everything is so separately united, as soon as one begins to describe a flower or a tree or a storm or a chipmunk, up jumps the whole heavens and earth and God himself in one inseparable glory. Now, I don't know if she meant that as pantheism, but I mean it as God created everything to live, and to live in cooperation with each other, and actually live dependent on each other. And so that's what I take out. I just like the way she worded it. So just so nobody goes away from here thinking, oh, that guy's teaching pantheism. I don't think that that's what she meant, but it could be interpreted that way if you wanted to. So we need to do what Job said in 12 verse 8. We need to go to the earth, or speak to the earth, and let it teach us. So that's what we're going to do. Anybody know what that's a diagram of? Photosynthesis. I heard somebody say photosynthesis. All life on this earth, in physical terms, depends on that. All life depends on that plant being able to capture that solar energy, convert it to physical energy, like sugars or carbohydrates or fats, that then can be used, like, I think there's going to be a talk on woodlot management and doing wood. I think I can keep my hand off that. Now, this energy can be used to build structure. It can be used to build tools and components and machines that provide for our nourishment. But there are conditions that are necessary. Like I said, solar energy has to be captured by that plant. The plant has to have carbon dioxide to build into the sugars, and it'll give off oxygen. It also has to have water to complete that process. So you need energy, carbon dioxide, and water. Now, you can't take if I took some CO2 and I took some water and I threw them up into the air and they mixed in the air in the middle of that sunshine, would you get sugar? No, you wouldn't. There's a whole lot more to the process. It's like, thinking that a car, you went out and bought a car, and that thing just kind of came together on its own. A bunch of parts just were in the same place at the same time, and they kind of came together. No, it was actually designed. It was a plant, a manufacturing plant was built and equipped, fitted so that it could build that vehicle. And then all the ancillary support industries that produced all of those parts and components and everything else, plants are the same way. There has to be a whole system in place for that to work. And all of life on a physical basis depends on that. Obviously, we depend primarily on the breath of life, the Spirit of God, but we, on a physical basis. And I tell people this, and hopefully I don't get too far ahead of myself on any of these things, but we do a fairly good job, with spiritual nourishment. Most people do a fairly good job. We may get sidetracked and distracted sometimes and everything, but spiritually nourishment, we generally do a fairly good job. We do a terrible job on physical nourishment. Terrible job. Part of it is because we buy into the world's philosophy. We buy into the world's practices. And so we just assume that we can go to the grocery store and buy the foods that we need, and we'll be good. And of course, then we take it a step further and say buy specific types of foods. I'm going to put this out here too, just as a thought for you. The longest lived people group in the world, their diet is plant-based. What about the second longest lived people group in the world? It's almost totally animal-based. Almost completely animal-based. Now, vegetarians get mad at me when I share this stuff. There's a reason why. You can be eating the right foods, and those right foods have no value to them at all. And you could eat the foods that may not be the best foods for you, but the way that they were raised and produced and everything like that, your odds of being healthier eating those foods are way better than eating foods that are poorly produced, even if they're the right foods. So we just need to keep that in mind. Now, I have a plant-based diet. No, I'm not knocking anybody if they don't have a completely plant-based diet. There are places in the world where it's a challenge to do that. What we need is nourishment. We need to understand how to achieve that nourishment. And there's a reason why that second longest lived people group is doing well, even though they're not eating what we would consider to be the best source of food. So whatever we do, we have to do it so that this process happens really good. So the photosynthesis is maximized, and the ability for that energy that's produced to actually be able to produce food for us to consume, that whole system is working really well. Do you know that most plants only photosynthesize at about 25% capacity? If you could get it just to 50%, it would blow your mind what that food is like. And in doing so, you would eliminate a whole bunch of the problems you have growing your food, just simply by elevating the level. And we're gonna talk about that more as we get there. So anyway, getting this to function at the level that it's supposed to function at, which is not even close to. Has anybody ever gone out and looked at, like, I like growing melons. Have you ever gone out and seen how many flowers, female flowers are on that melon plant? Well, it never sets all those, does it? What if it did? You know, fruit tree growers, they thin their fruit because the tree can't handle the whole fruit load. But what if it could? And what if it could? And I know growers where it can, and the fruit is even bigger. Wow. I know we don't see this stuff, so they're like, this is pie in the sky. I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I'm going to tell you that because I want you to believe that this is possible. But it requires following the pattern. Exactly. That's the equation. 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules in the presence of chlorophyll and there's actually more pigments that are oranges and reds and things like that that actually capture a broader spectrum of the light spectrum, more spectrums of the light spectrum, but chlorophyll is the primary one, and sunlight produces C6H12O6. What's that? That's sugar. It's table sugar, that bad stuff. Since I have to adapt this as I go along because I got more material that we're going to be able to cover, but things come to my mind, I'm just going to share them. If I said salt, fat, and sugar, what would you think? Potato chips? Good, bad? Bad? Do you know the most nutritious food has the highest levels of sugar, the highest levels of fat, and the highest levels of salts? Now, it's not sodium chloride. When I say salts, we think sodium chloride. But I'm talking about calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, a whole bunch of trace metals like watermelon? Well, in general, even a watermelon is going to actually have the highest sugar content, but it's going to have flavor. The flavor is the salts, the organic acids that are produced from those salts. And then you're going to actually have fat in it. It's not going to be to the level like an avocado would be, but it's going to have fat in it, because all of the cell walls in that watermelon are built with lipids. That's fat. It's oil. So, bananas. Okay, well, it's a different makeup, but salt, fat, and sugar. The best bananas are going to have the highest levels of those things in it. Given what God intended a banana to be, just like a watermelon, some people put salt on watermelons. They say it makes it taste better. Any of you guys do that? Some people do. And what if the salt levels in the watermelon were so good that it made it taste that way without putting it on? Okay. So that's sugar. That's the starting point. And we have to have that. Now, we don't want it to stay as that. It's going to be built into other types of sugars. It's going to be built into carbohydrates. It's going to be built into fats. It's going to be utilized to build proteins and all of those things. So it's not all going to stay that way, but we have to have a lot of that for things to grow well. Okay. A recent survey of life on Earth measured in gigatons of carbon. Everything's about carbon lately. You notice that? We're going to, just a second here, we're going to show you that it matters, but not in the way that they say it matters. Okay, a recent survey of life on Earth measured in gigatons of carbon. Estimated there are 550 gigatons of carbon-based life forms. A gigaton is about 1 billion tons. So estimated about 550 gigatons of carbon-based life forms. Living organisms. I don't know how they measured that, so don't ask me. But 450 gigatons of the 550 gigatons are plants. So the vast majority of that are plants. 93% of the remaining 100 gigatons, so you subtract 450 from 550, you've got 100 gigatons left. 93% of the remaining 100 gigatons are microbes. So that's protists, archaea, fungi, bacteria, things we don't really notice or pay attention to in the soil. And you're going to find out as we go through this how important they are. Of the last 7%, or 7 gigatons, humans comprise 0.01% by weight of the biomass on Earth. Small, right? So here's the question. As we go through this, you'll see how much influence that biological world has over whether we thrive or not. The question is, are we in competition with it? Or should we be cooperating with it? God gave us dominion, didn't he? Yeah. Stewardship. We've done a terrible job with it. But we need to be in cooperation with that. We need to understand that. I don't think I have it in here, so I'll just say it. For every trillion human cells in your body, you have 10 trillion bacterial cells in your body. So you're way more bacteria than you are humans. So I'm sharing that because what is that doing? Is it helping me live? Or is it hindering me? We need to be exercising proper stewardship. We need to understand that God put life everywhere, and that life was designed to work together for everything to thrive. And we've done a terrible job of, one, understanding it, first of all, and we've done a terrible job of dominion. And we've tended to think that we're in competition with it, and we've tended to exploit it rather than actually steward it. Matthew 5:45, last half of it says, "For he causes his sun to shine on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." The blessings of God continually flow. They never stop, just as this verse says. But we certainly don't receive all those blessings. And the reason is because we put obstacles in the way to receive them. This is a big principle that you need to embrace. Quite often as Christians, we fight against sin. We fight against problems and everything like that. But we put very little effort into fostering what would remove it. And so this happens in agriculture too. The bugs come, we spray them. The diseases come, we spray them. The weeds come, we spray them. And everything. It's kind of like what happens in the Bible all the time. God's people tend to kill the messenger instead of heeding the message. And so this is what we typically do. But what we need to do is find out what is actually life-giving. You turn a light on in a room, what happens to the darkness? It goes away. When you foster life, death goes away. When you foster function, dysfunction goes away. So focus your efforts on fostering life. In fact, if any of you have to take medications, a lot of the medical profession, I was pursuing that, and I have my wife's a neonatal intensive care nurse and everything, and so I'm very familiar with a lot of what happens within the medical field. And the reality is that a lot of the practice is just fighting off death. It's treating symptoms to prevent those symptoms from causing failure. But the problem is the intervention itself will eventually cause failure. So they buy you time. I don't think I have it in here either, so I'll share these four. I think there's 4 types of interventions. There may be more. I've never had anybody come up and share any more with me, but there are 4 types of interventions. One is time-buying intervention, like I just shared. It buys you time. And like I said earlier, we need in a lot of cases, we need that time, and we need to be bought that time. But if you never change the conditions, the intervention will wind up doing you in itself. The second intervention is a cleansing intervention. And you see I like to tell the story of the parable of the woman who had the demon cast out. And cleansing, cleaning things up is a good thing. But the woman who had the demon cast out, and then she cleaned the house all up, and then what happened? She was 10 times as much of a problem as she had before because she didn't put anything in place. She didn't fill that emptiness with life. And so she wound up in a much worse condition. So cleansing interventions are a good thing, but not by themselves. The next one is nourishment. Properly nourished. And that's a fundamental intervention. A cleansing intervention with nourishment, proper nourishment, is fantastic. Proper nourishment and cleansing interventions with a time-buying intervention is fantastic because it'll eventually eliminate that time-buying intervention. And we'll talk about aspects of that as we go on. And the fourth one is divine intervention. I don't think we comprehend to the degree that God does intervene in order to prevent our adversary from destroying us. We're foolish enough as it is to cooperate with his nonsense. But, and I'll take as much of that intervention as I can get, but and pray for it. But the 2 things that we can really focus on, and the primary one we need to focus on really is nourishment. I call it 2 bookends. You have spiritual nourishment, you have physical nourishment, and all of the other nourishment in between, whether it's emotional and mental or social, any of those things are all supported by those 2 bookends. They're held up and held together by them. So foster life, don't fight death. as somebody mentioned this, the conditions. It's not about the presence of the germ, it's the terrain. But what do I mean by that? In the last half of the 1800s, anybody familiar with Louis Pasteur? Yeah. He discovered, he came up with germ theory. He developed penicillin. By the way, he's just talking about penicillin. Do you know almost anything that has any value whatsoever was discovered in nature first and just mimicked or imitated by man? Most of, a lot of the technology. Now, of course, those things were connected to other things. Like I said, they required other things and they had, input to say, okay, this is when this should happen. This is not when this should happen, or how much it should happen, or how little it should happen. But it has other factors that go along with it. And we've extracted things out and isolated them and concentrated them. We're going to talk about schools of thought, but like, for example, you can get organic pesticides and fungicides and different types of things to kill with. They're natural and they'll break down. They won't persist like some of the man-made chemistry does. But they're still concentrated. And they're taken out of context. Now, I'm not saying you should never use those. I'm saying that just understand that you're still killing things. That may be necessary to get you where you need to be, but if you continue just killing things, eventually you're just going to kill yourself. So Louis Pasteur came up with the germ theory that most of it in modern society accepts, believes in, and there really are, we call them germs. There really are organisms out there that can be pathogenic. In other words, they can cause you to get sick and they can kill you. There was another individual at the same time that came up with a different idea, a different concept relative to germs or organisms that could cause disease. And he called it the terrain theory. Has anybody heard of Antoine Béchamp? No, probably not, because they erased him from history as best they could. And his conclusion was that it was not the presence of the germ, but it was the condition of the host. He called it the terrain, but it was the condition of the host. Now, we know that to be true, and in fact, people are going back now and looking at the work that Béchamp did because they realized that he was probably more correct than Pasteur was. So you can have two fields side by side. I'll use an illustration. I was just listening to a presentation by John Kemp from Advancing EcoAg, and he was sharing that his brother and his dad were both growing black raspberries. And the fields were just across, not very far from each other. And one of them got ruined by spotted winged Drosophila. Has anybody heard of that yet? It's fairly new, so a lot of you probably haven't heard of it. It's a little insect. It lays its eggs in the fruit, and then the larvae hatch and ruin the fruit. Spotted winged Drosophila. And you'll hear it abbreviated as SWD a lot of the time. It's spreading. There are more and more problems spreading, by the way. I'm in the world of agriculture, so I hear a lot of things you guys probably would never hear. But there's a lot of things spreading that are going to be causing major problems in the not too distant future. And again, it's because the conditions are not such. The conditions are that these organisms are just doing their job. I'll share a story with you in just a second here, but so these two black raspberries fields, not very far from each other. One succumbed to spotted winged Drosophila and the other one didn't. Well, they were planning on both doing the same thing, but I think it was the son got busy with other stuff. Think of the parable of the sower here. Got busy with other stuff and didn't get done what he needed to get done as far as fertility and everything on its berries. And spotted winged Drosophila came in. And I'll just tell you here, I might tell you again, there's a reason why that female spotted winged Drosophila laid its eggs in those berries. And I won't take a long time because we're going to go into this, but the conditions were there, a food source was there, and the food source wasn't in the other field. Well, how could it be there? And they're both black raspberries. How could the food source be in that field and it not be in the other field? Because there were simple compounds in that fruit, and in this case, nitrates in that fruit. And spotted wing Drosophila has a simple digestive system. It cannot digest amino acids or peptides or proteins. It can only digest simple nitrogen compounds. And so mama could smell there's food here and lays her eggs there. And when they hatch, they have food. Whereas in the other field, that simple nitrogen compounds were being built into amino acids and peptides and proteins, and it couldn't digest it. So she's not going to lay the eggs there because they won't be able to feed, and they'll die. You're getting a little hint of where we're going to be going with a lot of this. So anyway, it's the condition of the soil, actually. It's a condition of the plant, but the condition of the plant is heavily dependent on the conditions in the soil. Now, we're talking about soil fertility here, but any growing system, whether it's a garden or thousands of acres, has also the climate to deal with. You have environmental influences. We're going to look at those and everything, but you have environmental influences that can impact and stress your crops. And you can have things you have totally no control over. A lot of these environmental influences you can have some ability to modify or address, but some of them you don't. I've had whole fields destroyed by a hail crop, and then we were done for the year. There wasn't enough season left. The Bible says there's a time and a season, and so we have these opportunities, windows of opportunities. The window comes and goes. Well, I couldn't, there was, unless I had it inside. I had a friend up in South Dakota who had a greenhouse, and he left it open because the weather said everything was going to be good. He went to church on Sabbath, and it hailed. So he had done his work to make sure he could protect it from this, but the weather information he had wasn't accurate. And so they were at church when it totally decimated all of his crops. So we don't have time to go into that, but this is a spiritual lesson that we need to learn, is that we live on a planet with 8 billion other people. 8 billion other people making, not such good decisions. And the effects can last for a brief period of time. They can last for a long, long time. Just think of the decisions Adam and Eve made thousands of years ago. Is it having an impact still? Yeah. So, but we live within that world. And sometimes, it's not appropriate for God to intervene and prevent those things from happening. I don't understand why, but I don't question God, and you'll see on Sabbath when I share. I don't question, why'd you do this to me? We live on a planet with a lot of other people. And we live within that pool of effects. And sometimes we don't have anything, we have no chance to do anything about some of the things that happen. But you need to remember this, is it's not, you can have, does anybody have blight on tomatoes or anything like that? Yeah, you can have that organism, which is Alternaria, you can have it on the leaves of one field of tomatoes, and you can have it on the leaves of another field of tomatoes, and it's going to damage one field, and it's not going to touch the other one. And one of the big differences is that plant that it's not going to bother is actually feeding it. It's giving. And in exchange, that Alternaria that at one point is a pathogen and there's a reason why it's feeding it, and the other plant's not feeding it. The other plant can't feed it because it's not functioning at a level where it's pressed down and overflowing, as the Bible says. And so I should share here, as these things come to my mind, I'm just going to share them. Maybe I'll be sharing them later too, I don't know. But God gave everything its food source. God gave everything that he created and designed a purpose and the resources to function in the way it should function. And a good illustration of this, when an organism does not have the food source it's supposed to have, it resorts to an alternative food source. And a gross illustration of this comes from the country of New Zealand. The national bird there is the kiwi bird. And the kiwi bird eats like I always lose the tree species it is, but it eats on the roots of the tree. Well, they have development over there like we have development here. And they started cutting down a lot of those trees. And so they were taking away the food source of the kiwi. You know what they resorted to as a food source? Somebody heard this before or knows it, sheep. And they would peck into the back of the sheep and eat their kidneys. That was their alternative food source. And they have a huge livestock industry in New Zealand, so that wasn't going real well. So they replanted the trees. Yeah. I don't know. I didn't. But whatever it was getting from its primary food source, it was able to get from the kidneys of the sheep. Now, I don't know if it could have gotten it anywhere else, but that was the source it chose to get it what it needed from. So they quickly started replanting the trees because the livestock industry was not happy about losing so many sheep to the bird. But it shows you how, and I share that because we call things pathogens. We call them diseases. We call them pests. But in reality, if they were properly nourished, just like you and I, they would be probiotic rather than pathogenic. They would be benign, and they would not be hostile. It's because they're doing things we don't want them to do, because we're not doing our job in stewardship. And so we don't want to hear the message, so we're just going to kill the messenger. So it's the conditions of the host. It's not the presence of the germ or the organism. It's the condition of the host that determines whether or not it will be pathogenic or destructive, or whether it will be beneficial. Actually, that alternaria that I was sharing about that produces early blight, it actually helps the plant when the plant feeds it. When it's photosynthesizing, like I talked about, at a high level, it's actually giving away food and feeding these leaf-dwelling organisms. We're going to get into that a little bit more later. Seeds want to grow. If you put a seed out in the ground, no matter whether you did anything or not to prepare for that, it's going to want to try to germinate and grow. Now, there's a point at which the seed comes with a package of nutrition in it. And believe it or not, it actually it's supposed to. And this is where one of the big problems is materializing now. It's supposed to come with a package of biology, microbes, in the seed too. So when it germinates, these microbes that are symbiotic with it immediately begin helping the plant to grow and to be nourished. Well, I've noticed over the last few years that the quality of seed has really gone downhill, and I think this is a big part of it. I used to be able to save seed for 5-10 years. Sometimes longer. I'd seed longer than that, and I could still plant it and it'd grow. Now you're lucky if you can get 1 or 2 years out of seed before the germination rate just drops off a cliff. Part of it is nourishment. Part of it is the lack of these microbes in the seed, because they weren't present when the seed was produced. So they're not in there. But the seed wants to grow. So you put it in the ground, and it's going to try to germinate and grow. The real question is, what is the mandate of that plant? What is our mandate? What is the mandate God gave us? To be fruitful and multiply and increase. That's the mandate of that plant. And that plant, contrary to people, that plant will do everything it possibly can to bear fruit. Nature is not in rebellion against God. Man is. And man is having an awful influence on nature. But it's going to want to do that. But what if it doesn't have the resources to do it? What's going to happen? Have you ever seen your plants grow and like a tomato, we'll use a tomato plant again. And you plant that tomato plant, it grows up, it sets fruit and everything. It starts developing that fruit, and all of a sudden the plant collapses. Blight comes in, early, late blight, other diseases and stuff like that. Well, the plant didn't have enough resources to complete its mandate. It's pouring all of its resources into bearing fruit. And so it's taking nutrients out of the leaves. It's diverting energy from the roots, from the leaves, in order to try to produce seed, to bear fruit. And it just runs out of resources and things collapse. I was staying with my sister in North Carolina when I was younger for just a little while. And I just learned, has anybody heard of the double dig method? Okay, well, I just learned that and I really wanted to try it out. It sounded intriguing to me and everything. So I found a spot in her field by her house there where I could do a double dig. And like I said, I love planting melons. So I did the double dig, all that work. It's a lot of work. Anybody done it? It's a lot of work. And so I got a double dug and it was, it was up, several inches higher than the soil around it. It looked great. And I was proud of myself and everything. And I planted some melon seeds because I love growing melons and watermelons. And planted the seeds. My sister wanted to plant some flower seeds. So she came out the back door of her house, down where, just beside it there, the soil was kind of hard and everything like that. And she took a spoon and dug a hole big enough just to put the seeds in and planted the seeds. And her flowers came up. And field mice ate my seed. And nothing came up because they ate the seed. They dug it out and they ate all the seed. But the point being is that even with that little bit of effort, the seeds germinated and grow. Now, there's more and more problem with that now. Of getting seeds to actually germinate. The seed is having an issue now. But in general, seeds want to grow. You want to put them in the ground. The question is, can they achieve maturity? Can fulfill their mandate to bear fruit and to provide seed to the sower and bread to the eater? Can they do that? And the reality is we use an unbelievable amount of chemicals on plants to get them to maturity. And I tell people if those types of interventions are required to bring that crop to maturity, you will require intervention. That will not provide adequate nourishment to you if it had to have intervention. Now, when I say intervention, there's different types of intervention, and we need intervention. We need the righteousness of Christ filling us. Good point. All the time. We're going to get to that later. So there is interventions need to happen if we're going to change the conditions in our soil, right? The real question is, well, what type of intervention are we going to utilize? Okay, so let's keep moving here. I think I made that point. I want to ask a question. What is organic growth? And underneath is a phrase that says, seeing what you look at. That's a phrase that Dr. Kerry Reams, has anybody heard of Kerry Reams? Yeah, some of you probably heard of him. He was an Adventist. There's a whole school of thought based on his work, much of which has validity, but there's some flaws in it. But he always used to say, see what you look at. I used to put a picture up, I don't have it in here, but I used to put a picture of dandelion growing after this. And I asked people, what do you see? But I was doing it in Adventist groups, and too many people were saying a great salad ingredient. They weren't saying what. Most people would say a weed needs to be gotten rid of. Yeah, a problem. But that dandelion was a messenger. It was telling you, and this information is out there. There are several books written on, why certain plants are growing, where they're growing, what the conditions are that are causing them to grow there. And if you change the conditions, they'll stop growing there. We'll get into that when we get to the weeds. I don't know if we want to go into the weeds or not, but. Okay, so the question here is, what is organic growth? Now, people will say, well, it's what organic growers do, or certified organic growers, but that's not what the term actually means. Now, what it actually means is what will actually grow without intervention, naturally within a system. You drive down the road, there's all kinds of stuff growing on this property, and I'm sure some of it was without any intervention. In other words, nothing, you haven't done anything to the fields or anything like that. But it's still growing there. That's organic growth. And nature will always try to grow, produce, be productive to the highest level it possibly can and maintain stability. If you exceed that level, things will start collapsing. An illustration of this was I lived in Colorado for 20 years. And later on in that period, we had the pine blister beetle that came in and just decimated hundreds of millions of pine trees. Just whole mountains earlier on when I lived there, they were beautiful green with pine trees, and now they were all dead. Well, the conditions were exceeded. That natural system could maintain stability there, and it collapsed. And a lot of times when we want to plant a garden or start growing things, we come in, we work the ground up, we put the stuff in, and our expectations is beyond what that soil can actually maintain with stability. And so we run into problems. Now, sometimes you'll do that and you'll dig it up, and there's enough residual fertility that's built up over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years that you'll have a pretty good garden the first year, but the second year, not so much, and the third year, it's pretty bad. But our expectations are beyond what the capacity of that system is. But that's what organic growth is. It is the highest functioning level that nature can maintain with stability. So let's look at some pictures here, and I'll ask the question whether you think this is organic growth or this is not organic growth. Is that organic growth? There's not much growth there, but it's organic growth. This is the Kalahari Desert on the Western Cape of South Africa. It's organic growth. That's the capacity of that soil to maintain growth and stability. What do you think is lacking there? Water is a good big one. Could be lots of other things too. But water for sure is a problem here. That picture before, if you look up to the right, that's the valley. This is the valley next to it. And if you want to know what that is, it's seedless grapes covering that whole valley. By changing the conditions, they produce the capacity, they generate an incredible amount of grapes out in this area, and other fruits and stuff like that. And water was a big problem. There were fertility issues too, but water was, But if you looked at that picture, kind of obvious, isn't it? There's probably not a whole lot of water there, right? The Orange River is only, I think it's only about a mile or so, maybe more than a mile or so from here. But they diverted water from the Orange River, and you see lots of valleys like this producing tremendous amount of produce. Okay, what about this picture? Do you think that's organic growth? This is a picture in New Zealand, some of those famous New Zealand sheep. Everybody thinks it's organic growth? It's not. Does anybody see anything in that picture that would make it obvious that it's not? Yeah, it's actually the sheep. Now, it's not because not because sheep weren't naturally there. It's a different reason. When they first came to New Zealand, the island of New Zealand, of course, it was with prisoners and everything like that, but they saw this lush growth and thought, well, it'd be great to bring livestock here. That's why there's so much livestock there, because they had all this lush growth. And so they brought the livestock, and the livestock started feeding on the forage and everything like that, and started dying. And most people don't know why, but I'll tell you why. An element that's only required in 1 part per million, 2 pounds in a 2 million pound plow layer, just 2 pounds, cobalt, was missing from that soil. And they could not produce B12 because the center atom in B12 is cyanocobalamin. It's cobalt. And I think because, for the sake of time, I will skip the story. Somebody can ask me later about B12 and cobalt, because one of the things that I wondered about when I first became a Seventh-day Adventist was, we're always told we need to be lacto-ovo. We can't be vegan. And the big reason why we're told that is because of B12. Well, I'm going to tell you this, but don't you go running off out of here saying, hey, we don't have to take any B12 anymore. But there are conditions when they're created where you can get as much B12 as you need from the plants growing in the soil and out of your own gut. Now, there are conditions, so don't anybody go out here and cause a problem for me because I said that. There are conditions. But what's missing here is the cobalt. You can't see that, can you? So some things are pretty obvious that they're lacking. Other things are pretty obscure. The way they found out is they had to do some research and to figure out what was the problem was, and that's when they discovered that there was no cobalt, so that they could produce B12. Now, cobalt's another one of those elements that is not considered essential, and yet B12, animals have to have it. So they put salt licks out with cobalt in it for animals, assuming everybody's going to eat animals. But I would suggest, like Gary Zimmer, another big grower up in Wisconsin, suggests, he said, you better learn something about the food supply, because you may want to be supplementing. Now, I say supplementing, but that's a tricky process in and of itself, and it's expensive. We resort to all of these things instead of actually just focusing on proper nourishment. How do we generate proper nourishment? So you have the whole supplement industry, and then we have problems because of photosynthetic production, where you have tremendous problems with weight gain. We have another, we'll save that one. But you have all of these issues that tons of money gets poured into. I don't know what the numbers are. I did it. It's been 10 or 15 years ago now, but we're spending half what we used to on food in real dollars, in real terms. We're spending at least half what we used to spend on food. And we're spending many, many times over. It's somewhere between 5 and 10 times more on healthcare. And I'm not taking into consideration the cost of supplementation, the cost of diet programs, the cost of, all of the lost productivity and quality of life, and, all of that. We would be way better off investing in nourishment, proper nourishment, than we would in buying into that system. But it requires conditions. All right, I'll be a little easy on you on this next one. Is that organic growth? No. Somebody planted that. Somebody deliberately planted that and is growing it there. So whether or not this system can support what this person is doing here, I don't know. I just put the picture in there, so I don't know what kind of problems and everything. We always take the pictures when everything looks really good. When we get to it, I'll point it out to you. The backdrop on where I have some of the writing slides is my farm. So look at it next time you look there. And be honest, it doesn't look like that right now. Because even after 32 years, things happen, and you make mistakes, and I'll explain as we go along on that. But, it's beautiful. Just look at the picture when you see it next time. Organic growth? Nope. No, the trees were planted. Somebody's taking care of them. Somebody's intervened there and is deliberately producing that crop. It's apples. Organic growth? Nope. Organic growth? No. So you get the picture now, right? Okay. If we're doing something with that soil system to produce something, it's not organic growth anymore. It's intervention. Yep. So the question is that intervention imposed upon it or imparted to it? Because quite often what's actually happening is we impose upon those systems, and then the problems that are created as in the process, we resort to chemistry to deal with those problems. And as I said, if those crops had to have interventions, and there's hardly a crop, I would venture to say that 99.99999% of the food produced had to have lots of interventions. I used to drive a truck for a natural food company, and I was coming out of El Paso, Texas, heading to Roswell, New Mexico, and a truck came flying by me and there was cows in the back, and one of them was upside down. I mean, he was just flying, and I said, "Where are you going?" On CB, I said, "Where are you going in such a hurry?" He said, "I got to get to the slaughterhouse, because if they're alive when I get there, they can slaughter them. If they're dead, they can't." That's the food industry that well, hopefully none of you guys have to deal with that. Okay, so we want to impart the right conditions to it. We want to recognize that if we want it to function at a higher level, we have to impart the conditions that will allow it to function at that level. Otherwise, people are always trying to cut corners and trying to get something for less than they really need. I live within an Amish community, and my neighbor came over one time, and he's a builder actually, but he was visiting one day, and he was telling me about this guy that raises cattle and how he was using beer mash and all these things where he was producing weight gain like 10 cents a pound or something like that. And I was thinking to myself, I just said to him, it just came to mind, I said, does he realize that somebody's actually going to eat that? But this is not the mindset that happens in agriculture. We'll get into that when we get to the photosynthetic and biosynthetic process. Okay, so the question is there an ideal model soil? Yes, there is. I'll just say yes, there is. And there it is. Okay, you'll notice we'll go through this. The ideal soil, if you were to take a bucket of soil, within that bucket, about 40%, 45% of that volume of that bucket would be mineral particles, sand, silt, clay, but it would be mineral particles, solids. The other half of that bucket, or 50% of that bucket, should be pore space or air space within that soil. And in that airspace, 25% of that, or half of that, 50%, should be filled with water. And then the last 5% is made up of organic matter, which is organisms' roots, and stable organic matter, humus. Okay, that's it. So we're done. You guys can go and get to it. You don't have any more questions, right? Oh, yeah. Nobody disagrees that this is the ideal soil. Nobody disagrees that this is the ideal soil. But do you notice anywhere where you might have a question? Yeah, one question, I heard it. If you don't have that, how do you get to it? Another question might be, okay, well, of that mineral stuff, what's it made up of? Is it just anything? When God made Adam in the garden, did he just throw a bunch of random stuff in the air and it fell down as Adam? Or was there a specific order to what he made him from? Yeah. So the real question is, and the interesting thing, now this is changing a little bit, but if you were in an agronomy, a basic soil science class, agronomy class, and they put this up here, and they said this is the ideal soil, and a student raises his hand, and somebody asks that question, okay, if I don't have that, how do I get it? The typical answer you would get back is, we don't know. How do you know it's the ideal soil then, for one thing? But there are reasons that they know why. It's particularly about the structure of the soil. Now, the debate is over on that right side with the mineral components as to what's relevant and important there and what's not. Well,
This is the pattern. What you actually have to know what your soil itself is. You know what to put in.
yeah. So the question was, don't you need to know what your soil is actually made up of, in a sense? And so, what do I lack? What do I have too much of? Yeah, that's what we're getting at. So we're going to get to that point. Is, what is that made up of? And how does it accomplish getting 50% of that volume as airspace, half of it filled with water? What creates those conditions? Because if you have those conditions, stuff will grow really well. We're going to go out. I need to get a canning jar, a quart canning jar. I don't need it right now. We'll do it. I don't know if we'll even get to it today, but we're gonna look at the texture of Mel's soil here, and I'm going to show you how to pull a soil sample too. We're going to go through some more stuff before we get to that. Okay, so there's more detail you have to have here in order to achieve this ideal. There's more information you have to have. And so part of that information is you have to know what's there. What's supposed to be there, and why, and what is there. This is when we get into the different schools of thought. Remember I said, nobody disagrees with what I just showed you would be the ideal soil. But the different schools of thought of how to get that ideal soil are diverse, different. And I've been doing this for 32 years, and I can tell you that there's only one that's actually consistently worked in those 32 years. Every single one of them has virtues to it. Every one of them. But as the devil likes to do, he mingles, a little bit of error with a lot of truth. And another interesting thing that I've observed over the 32 years that I've been doing this is people want to avoid having to address character. They want to find some way other than actually having to acknowledge a flawed character, that there is a right character and that mine is flawed. So if you can come up with some other reason, then you can avoid accountability. Well, the same thing holds true with the soil, character of the soil. And that's why these different schools of thought. So we'll just go through them real quick here. How are we doing for time? We got about 12 minutes. The first one is conventional, and that's pretty much, the lion's share of agriculture. And they use selective chemistry to mediate their growth. So they'll use NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's what they focus on, and we'll get to it here. I think it's in another slide or two. That produces yield. It produces volume, calories, hundredweight, bushels, bins. Farmers get paid by volume, by weight. And so unless somebody's willing to pay them for quality, so it's quantity. So unless somebody's willing to pay them for quality, they're not going to spend the money on it. You know how much iodine, even though iodine I mentioned earlier, you know how much a pound of iodine is? A calcium iodate. You can get kelp meal too, and it has iodine in it as well. Sea minerals, you can get iodine in those too. But, I'll do it by the ton. I don't remember what it breaks down to, but it's like $27,000 a ton. Cobalt is the same. Cobalt is used in producing electric vehicles. And so the cost of cobalt has gone out the roof. Manganese is another nutritional element that the price has gone out the roof. It went from $50 a 55-pound bag last year to over 100 this year. I'm sharing that one because don't delay, because it's manganese. Never going to get cheaper. It's never going to get cheaper. But it's selective chemistry. The problem is that it'll produce calories, it'll produce quantity, but it won't produce quality. It won't produce nourishing food. And it's one of the reasons we're having the health problems that we are. I may not mention it somewhere else, so I'll just mention it here. One of the ways that they measure feed quality for those people who are raising livestock, and one of is the crude protein, is they simply measure the nitrogen content in the feed, and they have a factor that they calculate that by. I think it's 6.25. And that tells them how much protein is in the feed. But what they've discovered just recently is just because the nitrogen's there doesn't mean the protein's there. And so you have all kinds of incomplete proteins. Lack of sulfur being one of the big problems with that. We'll talk about that when we get to the individual elements. And all these autoimmune diseases and allergies that people are developing, it's because you got food that's not made right. And so your body, when you consume it, your body's saying this doesn't belong in my body, and it attacks it. And you have the allergic reaction or the autoimmune reaction to it. And those health issues are going out the roof too, increasing. And it's interesting that this is just observed by me. I don't have the data to prove that it's true, but sulfur easily leaches out of the soil, and it's essential for the sulfur-based amino acids to produce proteins. And it's been removed from the sources that it typically came from. They took it out of gasoline, fossil fuels, coal. They took it out of, used to be incidental in some of the fertilizers, materials that they didn't refine as much and everything. It's all gone from there. And the average age of a farmer in the United States, anyway, I think it's true in Canada too, is about 60 plus years old. And their mindset is back when those things all were different. And so I believe that it's actually the lack of sulfur. And when I do soil tests for growers, it's almost universally deficient. Yeah. And it was actually, that's where the farmers depended on their sulfur source. Right. The real issue was a soil character issue. Just like you can solve every problem in life if you address the character of the soil and you address the character of man. And we're really not doing either one to any extent. So let's try to get through these. I can here. We'll do these real quick. Organic, so the conventional school of thought is just to produce yield, quantity. And with nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, you can largely do that. Sometimes they'll use liming, which we'll talk about later. Or the organic school of thought is to generate it off the farm. So all of your fertility, all of your nutrition, everything like that can be generated one way or another off the farm. And to some extent, that's true. But it's not completely true. And if it's, there used to be a song, this is back before I was an Adventist, but it used to be a song, it was nothing from nothing leaves nothing. And, if you don't have it, you don't have it. Now, it's possible that it could be there, and it's just it's in a form that's not accessible. And we'll see as we go down these schools of thought that one of the schools of thought is about, or a couple of them, is about actually getting microbes to access it, which is possible. And we'll talk about those aspects of it. But so farm-generated mediation is primarily what it is. Now, somebody will argue with me about the particulars of any one of these definitions, but in general, this is a generalization of it, and there may be other facets to it. Biodynamic school of thought is holistic, esoteric mediation. Okay, so there's some, and this is partly true in some respects. There is a spirit of God that's sustaining life. But this is kind of like this esoteric, mysterious, holistic, everything's kind of works with everything, and which has some validity to it. But it migrates its way into, you'll find that a lot of these schools migrate their way into, we're in competition with nature. And our form of dominion is imposition. We're going to exploit and we're going to impose ourselves on these natural systems and make them do what we want them to do. Okay, permaculture is just a natural ecosystem mediation, very similar to biodynamic, where you want to just keep things as they are. You don't want them to get any worse. And so you kind of let the natural systems do their thing. But my observation is, without any intervention, natural systems deteriorate over time. The Bible says the earth is waxing old like a garment, and that's what you see if you honestly look at it. It's not advancing. A lot of people with lots of ideas that somehow or another, via evolution, things are advancing. They're not advancing. They're declining. They're deteriorating. The biological school of thought is microbial mediation, the idea that the biology in the soil can straighten things out. And we don't have time to go into the details of each one of these schools of thought, but there is some validity that the microbes in the soil can mediate fertility, but it's limited to the extent that they can do that, and there's fragility to it. The model that I use are the bottom two. The one I'm going to talk about next is the one that primarily I use, and that's complete and balanced chemistry. I'm talking about character. When I say chemistry, I'm talking about character and addressing what should the character of that soil be so that you get the porosity in it, so that soil can breathe, so that water can move in that soil. And then when I say move, not just down, but you want a soil that has capillarity so that water can move up and down and sideways, and you want it as deep as you can possibly get it. So if you go into a drought situation, I'll tell this story. There was a grower in 2012 when they had a really severe drought in the Midwest, and pretty much, they lost the majority of the crops, corn crops, and soybean crops there. And what most people don't realize is they're growing in a planter box. There's compaction only about 6 inches deep in that soil. And so when the rain shut off and that compaction layer hardened up, if the roots hadn't gotten through it yet, they weren't getting through it. But there was one grower, and I kicked myself every time because I didn't ask him for the pictures, who had the best crop he had ever had that year. One of the reasons being because it was so much sunshine. No cloud cover, no rain. He had so much sunshine to capture all that energy. But he took photographs. He was growing silage corn, and it was 13 feet tall, 12, 13 feet tall. Green from the top to the bottom. And around the base, this is the fascinating part, around the base of those plants, there was a diameter circle of moisture. It hadn't rained in weeks, and yet there was a moist area around each one of the plants. And they came and they did what they dug a pit because they wanted to see how deep were these roots going. Where was that water coming from? Because it wasn't coming from the sky, and it wasn't coming from wells. And they dug down 6 feet, and the roots were still going. And these plants were just pulling water. Water was coming up from deep reservoir, deeper reservoirs of moisture in the soil was coming up. He also had the ability, which we'll talk about when we get to the biology stuff. Microbes, when a plant, we'll talk about more, so I'll explain that later, but there's a point at which plants can't get any more water out of the soil, but microbes can. And so because of the conditions he had created in his soil, the microbes were also pulling moisture where moisture couldn't be had by the plant roots. They just couldn't get it. They couldn't pull against the energy gradient, but the microbes could get it and everything. So creating the conditions will afford you and I the ability to endure very difficult circumstances when you cannot buy and sell. There are things happening right now which may restrict your ability to get any nitrogen. So you want to have your system so that all the natural nitrogen cycling is going on. You've got all the free living and symbiotic nitrogen fixers, the bacteria in the soil doing their thing. You want the ability for phosphorus to be, solubilized out of that soil, because those two things right there, they may cut off in the not too distant future because of a poor stewardship of them. And groundwater contamination and pollution of surface waters and things like that, they may cut them off. The other thing going on right now is I talked about carbon, and we'll talk about it again when we get to that part of it. I got to hurry. They may start requiring you to demonstrate that you're sequestering enough carbon in your ground. And if you're not, they'll cut you off from growing. Now, you have a bunch of big industries right now that are supporting what they're calling carbon credits, where they're going to pay growers for sequestering carbon and everything. The only reason that they're supportive of it is the regenerative ag school that we're going to talk about in just a second here. The only reason they're supportive about it because they can pay off so that they can pollute. That's the only reason they're supportive of it. Because not because it's better stewardship of the land, but because they can offset their pollution by saying, well, this person is compensating for my pollution and everything. And nobody knows if that'll work. And I better not get into the process they're going to use for this. That the lab that I work with, the lab director there showed us this machine last time I was there, and they called it Karen because it's so impossible to deal with. But they take this, just a few milligrams of soil that's supposed to represent a whole field, and put it into this machine. And if you don't get it precisely within a certain weight range, it doesn't work. It's a ridiculous process, but this is where things are going and everything. And all you have to do is put one little piece of microplastic in that test, and it'll show that you've got all this carbon sequestered. Well, the real reason I'm telling you this stuff is because when they come to say, we're not going to let you do this, you can already say we're already doing it. We are sequestering carbon. We are natural nitrogen cycling. We are natural phosphorus cycling. And on top of that, we're producing healthy people. So you're not at what are they going to condemn you for? Now, there's plenty of other things they can condemn you for, but don't give them any extras. You can show that your stewardship of life is conducive to life and supportive of a clean environment and a clean and healthy environment. So we want to get there before we have to be there, because if you wait till you have to be there, you probably never get there. Okay, and the last one is, you start with that. It doesn't exclude the physics or the physical structure of the soil. It doesn't exclude biology. The man who developed this back in the early 1900s, when we were supposed to be doing it and we were going the other way, developed this over about a 50-year period, was a soil microbiologist. So his goal was already, how can we maximize life, truly maximize life in this process? So it's the chemistry. You remember you said you wanted that structure so that they had the pore space and everything. It's by the chemistry that you achieve that. And by the chemistry, you actually produce house and the nutritional resources for the biology to thrive. And you'll see why you want that to happen when it comes to nourishment. Okay, the regenerative ag is basically a microbial mediation. Oh, by the way, the chemistry, just like character, the chemistry can handle hits and recover. And we'll see when we talk about tillage about that. It can actually handle it. It didn't go anywhere, and it can restructure fairly rapidly. Whereas biology, which is the microbial mediation structuring, can be lost like that. And so you want both, but one's more durable than the other. But it's microbial mediation, basically. We'll talk about the principles here. But we'll probably stop there because it's already after 1. We'll pick up with soil health principles that we need to look at. Okay? Sorry, I said I was going to leave some time for questions, and I didn't. I'm happy to stay. If you guys want to keep going, you can. I'm happy to stay here for a few minutes and answer any questions if anybody has them. On Friday, there'll be a panel discussion if you have questions. So if you want to stop the videoing or whatever, or I'm happy to, but it is after 1, so a few minutes.
About composting leaves, because I tried to put something there only in leaves, and it grows so good.
Okay, the question was about composting leaves and then growing stuff on it. Are you willing to wait for an answer on that? Because we're going to get into that, the whole carbon fertility thing, if you're willing to answer. It works until it doesn't work, is be the short answer. It works until it doesn't work. And I'll get into the reasons why it works, or organic materials like that, why they work, but how you can eventually get yourself in trouble with it if you're depending solely on that and you're really not knowing what the actual conditions are that you're working with.
What should the attractive until penny?
Okay, the question was, what should the 45% mineral particles consist of?
Yeah.
I'll ask you if you can wait for that answer. We're going to be getting to that. We're going to be getting to that fairly soon. We may get to it today. If not, it'll be tomorrow morning. It's a longer answer than I can give like I just gave there. So, but there is a balance. If you had a bucket, let me just say this. Soils have different capacity. I think there's a parable in the Bible about talents. Soils have different capacities, so you need to know how big your bucket is. I use the illustration of a bucket. How big is a bucket, and what should the bucket be filled with? Okay, and so you can measure. We know what the bucket should be filled with, depending on what its size is. And so it's just a matter of measuring. We'll talk about that. We're going to spell out what should be in that bucket. But we know how to do that. And so it's just a matter of knowing good information leads to good decisions, and good decisions lead to good outcomes. And if you're just shooting in the dark with stuff, it may go well, it may not. Sorry, just a second. Well, the question was, what soil composition has the most talent? A big bucket. But I'll qualify, a big bucket means they just have more fertility there. The question is, how balanced is that fertility? How complete is it? And how balanced is it? And I'll use this illustration real quick. We look at people with a lot of talent, and we admire them, but we don't know them completely. And I won't share any stories of any individuals, but I know very well of people that we admire who have some real flaws behind the scene. And so you can be very talented, but you have to be sure and the challenge with that is a little bucket's easy to fix because it's not as much stuff. But it doesn't, it has to be managed more carefully because you don't have as much capacity. A big bucket is great because you got a lot of capacity, but if you have to fix it, it takes a lot more to fix it. Let's see, you had a question, and I'll come in. Yeah. So if you know what the balance should be and you know what it is, then you address it by saying, okay, what do I need to apply to correct it? But okay, sorry. Go ahead and say the question again, sorry. Yeah, she asked if the balance was knowing what you're going to put in. Yes, by knowing what you want there and what you have there, you can know what you need to put in there. That's one here, and then I'll go there.
Get each with its soil, and we're producing that soil. Is it something you continue with and you just keep up, or?
So the question was, once you address the soil and everything you're growing in it, will you have to continue to grow that? And my answer is, I die daily. If you address it and you bring it into balance, it's not going to want to stay there. It's going to want to revert back to what it was. And so it has to be a continual imparting of the right conditions to it. Now, the longer you do that, the more you build oil in the lamp. We'll talk about that when we get to carbon fertility. So it takes longer so you can have a tarrying time and you still have oil in the lamp that you can tap as a resource. But yeah, it's something that has to be ongoing. It'll just migrate back to what it is and what it was. Expressing.
Question.
This week, will we be able to know what a healthy soil composition is, and we'll be able to administer the lack of the minerals or create balance? Will we be, after this?
So the question is, once I leave here, will you know what you need to do to administer all of this, to achieve that? You will. The question is, will you? Okay, sorry. I don't know who was next. Okay, all right. We'll just do a couple, three more, and then. Okay, so go ahead.
So, plant or each thing you're growing. Now, the systems stay the same when you go there for the Bible. But for each plant, it's going to be particular to that plant if it needs more of something, is it not?
Yeah, you have different types of plants, and they tend to pull heavier on certain nutrients. They're expressing a different. It's like the 12 sons of Israel, or the 12 manner of fruit on the tree. It expresses different qualities of the character of God, the beauty of it. And so this is an idea that people have, that you have to adjust the garden for whatever crop you're growing. But can you imagine, I've grown as many as 50 things in one time in an area less than an acre. Can you imagine trying to manipulate all that to the particulars? We didn't get to this yet, but we will, is you feed the soil and you let the soil feed the crop. You create a healthy, balanced soil, and that plant, whatever plant it is and whatever particulars it has, will access what it needs. It's like putting a banquet table there and say, take what you need. The key is to keep it there. So if you're growing tomatoes over and over and it's pulling heavier on certain nutrition, it uses a lot of potassium. Well, it uses a lot of things, and you don't address making sure that it's getting put back, eventually you'll go out of balance, and so if you're growing a variety of things that tends to slow down that process. But plant families are different, and so they do pull on different things heavier. But it's a matter of it's getting away from the idea of feeding the crop and getting to the idea of feeding the soil. All right. Okay.
If you're from your kitchen, take care of your banana fields, fruit and vegetable field. Is it recommended to put it on in the garden right away like that, or wait until it's broken down to become dry? Does it matter?
Well, it would be more accessible if it was composted or decomposed. You can put it in the garden that way, and the microbes will break it down. It's just a matter of when the plants will actually get it, because the microbes eat at the table first, not the plants. And so, well, we'll get into that when we get into the biology part of it. But plants actually create this condition where they give away 75% of their photosynthate that we talked about. Give it away. They dump it out their roots. They dump it onto their leaves to establish these microbial populations, particularly bacterial populations, but the fungi and everything. And they build a bank account. And they're going to come back later, and they're going to withdraw from that bank account. Everything. So, we'll get into more of that when we get into the biology part of it. There was one other question over here, I think.
If I'm not wrong, that we can get from cobalt so that we don't lose vitamin B12.
Okay, the question was, she didn't understand about when I was talking about the cobalt. Cobalt is a mineral element, and it's the center atom in the vitamin B12. It's what B12 is built on, is cobalt. And so you can't build cobalt, you can't build B12, the vitamin B12, without cobalt. Well, first of all, you want to know if it's in your soil or not already, because it might be. It might not be. It might not be in enough to really benefit from. And then there are sources for which we can go over. But I can tell you up here, well, you might be able to get it. Canada is a hard place. I've done work for some people in Canada, and getting cobalt up here they're very restrictive with it. So, okay. Thank you. We will pick up again where we left off this afternoon.